All right. So tonight is the night that's known as Nittelnacht, the night of Nittel. Now, this, of course, is generally a fun topic all around. People like to have fun with it. It's a punching bag for some. Uh, and this year, we're not going to delve too deeply into the general background, the general premise. But in short, the general premise is that this is a very central, important Christian holiday, and the term for it in some languages is Natal, which means birth, as it purports to celebrate the birth. And there's a very early, very old term in Jewish sources for this holiday, which is Nittel, which seems to follow the Jewish practice of taking the the name of the Avodah Zarah and changing it a bit in a derogatory fashion. So Nittel has some sense of taken away, or maybe Meloshin Nisla. We know that there was a very common term for Oisei Ish in early sources that he was the Tolui, so maybe it's Nittel with a tough. And there's much that's been said, much that's been written about this. Again, not what we're delving into here. So there's that. There's also much to say about the minhagim, and of course, the main minhag that everyone knows, that everyone's familiar with, is the minhag of refraining from learning Torah on this evening. And that's often what ends up being a lightning rod. People discuss it, debate it, have thoughts and opinions on it. In short, many seem to believe that it's a Hasidic practice, but as many others have pointed out, it is not originally a Hasidic practice, and it's a widespread Ashkenazi practice that dates back to proper Ashkenaz, to the German lands. And there's documentation of it from, I think, roughly 1500s, 1600s. And we find real Ashkenazische Rabbonim from the 1700s addressing it, discussing it. You have Chassam Sofer famously had his thoughts about it, etc. There's also the question of the reason. Many argue, many believe that it had to do with Gzeres, Redifus, but those who have researched the topic have argued that based on the early sources that we find for it, this is likely not the reason, and it in fact is closer to the perhaps to the Hasidic reason, to the reason that's often given in Chabad, the way it's described in Chabad, Shleila Hisif Chayas in the Klippus, so this is a night of Klippus, and you don't want to be Meisif Chayas, and in fact, at least my impression from seeing this a very famous classic article by Professor Mark Shapiro on the history of Nittel, which he wrote in 1999, and my impression, my take after seeing the sources there, was that the Chabad articulation is actually not that far off from roughly how it was understood and perceived originally. But again, this is all not what we're getting into. Now, this is being recorded, this is being shared. Actually, we went live here pretty much at Chatzois of Leil Nittel, of Nittel Nacht. Before I continue, I just wanted to mention about the name. One of my pet peeves is people that associate the minhag of Nittel Nacht with the word Nittel, but otherwise call the day something else. And I have insisted that if you're already familiar with the term Nittel Nacht, so why don't we just stick to the traditional Jewish Ashkenazi name for the day? So the day is the day of Nittel, and the night is Nittel Nacht, and that's the term we're going to be using throughout, whether in reference to the night or not. This is the day through the Jewish lens is the day of Nittel. So we went live here about the Chatzos of the night of Nittel, when according to the minhag, it's possible to start learning again. But we're actually going to focus here on another aspect of the Minhagim of Nittel, which in fact may be Shayach, or some would say is Dafka Shayach, after Chatzos. So we found the perfect time to, on the one hand, we can learn, but on the other hand, the minute we're going to discuss is Nageya, potentially after Chatzos. So what better time, I guess, to talk about it? I didn't begin with notes about what I wanted to say about Nittel in general. I just sort of made a note to myself to mention that we're going to just touch on Nittel in general and move on. But one additional point I wanted to make was that in light of the fact that it's not a Hasidic minhag, but an Ashkenazi minhag, we find here yet again that Dafka, the Hasidic communities, are preserving and perpetuating age-old Ashkenazi minhagim, and this is, in my opinion, it's a pattern. It's something we see rather often once you start looking out for it, and it's a fun point to think about, and maybe we'll elaborate on it more on some other occasion. But moving along to the topic at hand, like I said, we're going to talk about a particular detail, an interesting detail relating to the minhagim of Leil Nittel, and I'll just go ahead and say in short, we're talking about the aspects relating to the fact that we find Makaitis that say the mikveh noshim should be closed on the night of Nittel, and everything relating to that aspect of Nittel, that aspect of life. So just letting everyone know in advance that that's the theme, that's the focus here. We obviously want everyone to be comfortable with the topics that we're discussing, so just letting you know in advance that this is the topic. Obviously, we're not going to get particularly graphic, but that's the context. So we're going to discuss this aspect of the minhag of Nittel, which, as we will discover, seemingly has actually reached us through Sephardic sources, through Sephardic channels, which is perhaps somewhat unexpected. As well as in the process of putting this together, I also uncovered or brought into focus a much earlier Ashkenazi makar for these minhagim as well, that has not really received the proper attention, hasn't really been highlighted properly, and we'll get to that more towards the end. But we'll begin with this surprising transmission in the last 200-300 years, dafka through Sephardic sources. And in addition to the light this will shed on understanding this minhag in general, and I'll point out this is a topic, Nittel Nacht is a topic that many have written much about, and to the extent that it's really hard to find new Mar Mekaimis that haven't already been cited by someone, not necessarily, each makar, each contemporary source is probably only citing a partial amount of Makaitis, but if you go through enough contemporary Svarim, you'll find that every makar, every earlier makar that you'll find is likely been cited at least by someone, which is what I've discovered, which is what I have seen in the process of putting this together. However, even those who write about it, who cite the Makaitis, they tend to write about it, they'll cite the Makaitis, but the Makaitis will be just mixed together, commingled, and partial. And this is, to use the term again, a pet peeve of mine, where you have many Svarim today that are malaktim, they're malakat the sources, but most of them are not necessarily writing in a orderly, chronological, historical fashion. Instead, it's sort of just a dump of our Mekaimis with no regard for the development, the evolution, the process of how an idea was transmitted and developed. So just getting the sources in the right order and relaying it in such a fashion is alone a reason, is a benefit. It sheds light on the topic. And even though, of course, in the last couple of decades, there are many writers on halachic topics who do write in a much more orderly, chronological, historical fashion, but they've only managed to touch a very small number of topics so far, and there are infinite topics that still are waiting to be approached in this fashion. And it is my strong opinion that this is Nageya Tahavana, it's not really shaykh, it's not really possible to have a clear Havana in any topic in halacha, in my opinion, without the historical, chronological dimension. And I've said before that one of my ideas is that we need to write a chibur lefi seder Shulchan Aruch that will relay the building blocks of each simon in the Shulchan Aruch in a more chronological fashion, but more on that another time. So that alone, I think, will be beneficial and help shed light on the topic at hand here, even though all the Mar Mekaymis have been cited before by others. But in addition to that, like I intimated, like I indicated, this will also uncover something about the connection between the topic and Sfardim, which is a topic that many have brushed against, have touched on, but most of them are approaching it out of ignorance, meaning the question of whether Sfardim have a shaychus to Nittel or don't have a shaychus to Nittel is something where there's incomplete information and people make claims and make statements without the relevant and pertinent details. So, jumping into it, I'll begin with how I happened upon this topic. Recently, I came across a letter written by the Minchas Elazar, the Munkatcher, to a Talmud of his whose name was Reb Shlomo Zucker. He was the Av based in the Rav, presumably, of a town called Halas. I may not be pronouncing it entirely accurately, but something like that. This Talmud of his, after the Munkatcher passed away, printed a kuntres called Zecher Tzadik Levracha, and in the kuntres he was very close. He was a very close, devoted Talmud, and in the kuntres he wrote a hesped for his Rebbe, the Munkatcher, and then towards the end he also included a number of letters that he had personally received from the Munkatcher. So he got up and ahead, and for today we have the Mochin Emes, the Munkatcher of Borough Park has a Mochin dedicated to printing the Sfarm of the Munkatcher and an entire dynasty. So today they have a sefer Igros Shafirin, where they Shafirin being a play on the name Shapiro. So they've printed the Igros of the Munkatcher and perhaps other members of the dynasty in orderly fashion. But this Zecher Tzadik Levracha, this kuntres, got ahead of that and already printed a number of letters that he received from the Munkatcher. Another connection between the Munkatcher and the Shlomo Zucker is that there was actually a kuntres called Mashmiya Yeshua that laid out the shita of the Munkatcher on Bias HaGeula, the process leading up to the Geula. I believe it was written in conjunction with World War I, Chavle Mashiach, a whole mahalach that the Munkatcher had, and he had this Talmud, write the kuntres up for him. This kuntres was recently reprinted by the B'chain Emes Munkatch. We know that the Munkatcher has a sefer Chamisha Ma'amoris, so they printed a sefer called Chamisha Ma'amoris Nesafis. The incorrect grammatical and the feminine of Nesafis really bothers me each time I see it. It's in the title of the sefer, pretty unfortunate, but that's what they call it, Chamisha Ma'amoris Nesafis. It was printed just a few years ago, Tafshin Pei Beis. I actually bought a copy of it right when it was printed, so I have a copy at home. And you can find the kuntres Mashmiya. What's one of the Ma'amarim is the kuntres Mashmiya Yeshua, and they also have a Hakdama there where they explain some of the context and the background for that particular work. So one of the letters printed in Zecher Tzadik Levracha, now also in the Igros Shafirin, I believe it's around the Igeres Resh Tzadik Hey in that sefer, where they copied these letters. So if you look in the kuntres, in Siman Hey, there's a letter from the Munkatcher to Shlomo Zucker, dated early Yom Vav Erev Shabbos Kodesh Shmois Ta'azri, which presumably is Tafresh Pei Zayin Munkatch. So around this time of year, but maybe a couple of weeks later. The letter begins by acknowledging Reb Shlomo Zucker's sister getting engaged. Then he goes on to say, he says, Valdvar she'elosai mashakasav b'skulas Yisrael v'chulu, Tmehani lama heveis lazem iskulas Yisrael, halehu b'sefer chupas chasana hamafursam, bein ha-paiskim, b'sham kare chagom b'loshin acher, avol hainu hach. So with regard to your question about what it says in the Sefer Skulas Yisrael, I'm surprised that you're citing from Skulas Yisrael because it's already in the Sefer Chupas Chasanim that's famous among the Paiskim, and there refers to their holiday with another name, but it's all the same thing. Now, this is kind of cryptic because it's not actually spelling out or referring to the actual topic at hand. Obviously, both members of the parties to the correspondence were aware of what was being discussed, but to the outsider, it may seem a bit cryptic. But obviously, in the context that I'm presenting it now, it's probably more obvious. When I saw it, I saw it out of context, and it was still fairly obvious. So what does it say in the Sefer Segulas Yisrael? So if you look in the Sefer Segulas Yisrael was printed in the year Tafresh Samach 1905, so about 20 years prior. And it's a sefer that contains, literally as the name suggests, it's a collection of segulas. As we know, the history of segulas in the academic world, sometimes they'll refer to it as a branch of Jewish magic. The idea of there being books, works containing prescribed recipes, steps to be taken to affect a desired outcome in a more magical way. So today, obviously, segulas is a term that gets a lot of. It's also a lightning rod and gets a lot of attention. But the segulas we're familiar with today, I would say, are probably just the tip of the iceberg compared to the historical scope of what may have been contained in the term segulas. The term segula itself may also have evolved. There may have been other terms, other frameworks for understanding what exactly these things are. We're not getting into the topic and history of segulas here, but this sefer contains these types of recipes and prescribed steps or things to avoid as well, things that are dangerous, things that are harmful. That's also under the same rubric. Obviously, you have some of these things in Chazal themselves, and Yanei Sakana. So this was all contained in the sefer under the rubric of Segulas Yisrael. And it's a big sefer. I don't know how many pages. I don't have it in front of me, but it's pretty big. So in Sefer Segulas Yisrael, Marecha Zayin, which means topics beginning, it's so sorted by topic alphabetically. So topics beginning with letter Zayin, Ois Lamed Vav. So that the topic there is Zivug. And by Zivug we mean cohabitation between husband and wife. And under Zivug in Ois Lamed Vav, the Segulas Yisrael writes the following: B'Sefer Yimtza Chayim, I'm assuming that's the correct nikud. B'Sefer Yimtza Chayim Kosa v'Zel Shoynei. U'Bekisvei HaKodesh l'Rav Sadia Halevi Baal Sefer Nevei Tzedek Nimtza Kosa v'Zel Shoynei. So Yimtza Chayim is quoting Rav Sadia Halevi, who wrote, Yesh li zoher shaloi lase zivug im ishtei balayla shanoilad hanovi shalahem. Not to be with one's wife the night that their prophet was born. Leikein to defenu ruach ra ki azman groma sheyolid ben paretz. And if you don't follow this warning, then you'll be pursued by an evil spirit. It's the poor timing. The timing will lead to the child, the fruit of that union on this date. The child will be a ben paretz, will be a problematic child. And the quote continues, V'gila habal shem tev ziyah, the meshumodim sheyesh ba'olam, hein heim sheyotzu miziv v'goysei alayla. The Baal Shem Tov reveal that meshumodim, I don't know how common it is today, but before Off the Derech was invented, unfortunately we know that back in the Shtatlach, occasionally a child who went off the derech, often that meant that they were kishmad. As we know, historically, maybe I may have touched on it, mentioned it, that historically you really needed to belong to one or the other community. There wasn't, couldn't really exist and subsist and survive outside, if you were Jewish, outside of the Jewish community. If the Jewish community expelled you, you pretty much may have found yourself forced to convert. And sometimes children who wish to rebel against their parents, against their family, against their community, would run and shmad, perhaps to hurt their parents the way some people might be seeking to hurt their parents today in other ways. I think it's pretty rare to go all the way in shmadzich in this day and age, although it's not unheard of completely. So back then, it was somewhat of a more common occurrence. I'm not sure how many of us realize and appreciate how somewhat frequent this phenomenon was. So the phenomenon existed. The certain percentage, whatever it was, of children of a generation So what's the reason? People were very bothered by this. Why did this happen to them? The way the parents today may complain about other things their children are up to. So the answer is that it's from parents who weren't nizer in the zivug on this night, and the union of this night produced this outcome: children who became mishumadim. So it continues and he says, Sara Maher Tmias Hanashim Shiyoidim Bevidur Shlenivalu Lugoy. Uvneim Nishtamdu Rahman al-Islam. So, as we'll see, this is this is not in the original Yom Tzachayim, but it's from a later source that adds that this actually explains, this answers the women, the mothers, the Nabach, the mothers of Meshamadim, and they know that their child is not the fruit of a forbidden union with an Eino Yehudi. We're broadcasting online. I do think we have to sort of be careful, just like on TikTok, you have to say on a live. So I think when we mention terms like this, I think we need to be a little proactively careful. So I'm going to use a term like Eino Yehudi occasionally, words that were invented by the censorship a few centuries ago. And I don't know, maybe Akum, you could use Akum as well. So there is a rich history of self-censoring as well, with Chabad Rebbeim actually engaged in it. We know that Tzemach Tzedek will write Akum in his own writings to himself, even though surely you would think you could write the uncensored version, but that's another story for another time. So just as we find the Havdil and the Welt, that is proactive self-censoring on different platforms, so I think we can also borrow a bit of that. So this is casually dropping another bit of lore, which is that the more standard explanation for the Mishamadim was that Mistama, the mother of the Mishamid, Mistama, she was with an Eino Yehudi, and the product of that union was the reason why the child turned out messed up. So now, so it's mentioned in passing that Sara Mayer Tmias Hanashim Shedim Bevir Shaloi Nevalu, that this isn't the case, this isn't the reason. So what could the reason be if that's not the reason? So now we have a new reason. Baal Shem Tov revealed that that's the reason for the Mishamadim. So the so that could be the alternative reason, that it was a union with her taka with her husband, but on this inopportune date. And at the end of the passage in Skulos Yisrael, it says the source. What's the source of this passage? The source is Sefer Mare Yolodim. I'll mention here that this Shmuah b'Shem the Baal Shem Tov was later cited from either from the Mare Yolodim or from the Skulos Yisrael by way of one of these late sources. Is also cited in the Sefer Baal Shem Tov Al HaTorah, which is fairly famous. It's still around. I think they've reprinted it, redone it in the last couple of decades. So there's a Sefer Baal Shem Tov Al HaTorah that purported to collect every Shmuah ever cited b'Shem the Baal Shem Tov and sort it according to the order of the Psukim. So it is cited there. I don't remember exactly where. I don't have the exact reference in front of me, but fairly confident that it's there. And I think that's where I came across it actually many years ago, perhaps maybe even in childhood. I always remembered this Shmuah b'Shem the Baal Shem Tov about the Mishamadim. It always stuck in my mind. And I believe I saw it there. So that would have been another source that popularized this idea. So we have the Munkacher reacting to Shlomo Zucker, quoting the Sefer Skulos Yisrael. We look at the Skulos Yisrael. The Skulos Yisrael is quoting from the Mari Yolodim, who's quoting the Yom Tzachayim, who's quoting Reb Sadia Halevi. So who's the Yom Tzachayim? So the Sefer Yom Tzachayim is actually from the very fairly well-known Reb Chaim Palachi. Reb Chaim Palachi wrote many svarim, many of them have the name Chaim, or maybe all of them have the name Chaim in the title. One of the svarim is called Yom Tzachayim, and many of his svarim I think are just Malaket, Shtiklach. There's a rich tradition of svarim that are Malaket things. The Chidah has with Barkdemis in Yonei Agada. He also has in Yonei more Talmudic halachic in Yonim as well. A genre of being Malaket, Shtiklach, Marachas, short Shtiklach. So Chaim Palachi, I believe, also continued in that tradition. Yom Tzachayim is something along those lines. I don't have the sharp line in front of me to tell you what the exact premise of the Sefer is, but maybe Yom Tzachayim suggests that it's also a collection of good to eitzes or things to avoid. perhaps something along those lines. It should be easy to look up. So in the Sefer Yom Tzachayim by Reb Chaim Palachi, it was printed in the year Tafrei Shchof Gimel, so a few decades earlier, the 1860s. So in Siman Ayin Gimel, Eis Tes, at the end it says Taka, more or less as it was quoted before, but I'll quote it as it appears in the original. Bekisvi HaKodesh, let Rav Sadia Halevi Zal Baal Sefer Nevei Tzedek Nimtza Kosov, Yesh Li Yizar Shailasi Zivig Amishta Balayla Shanil Hanovi Shalahem, Dekoiden, and then it just says Dekoiden, Lei Kain to Defenu Ruach, Ki Azman Gramashiel Ben Paritz, but Gila Harav Baal Shin Tes, which is, so the word Baal is spelled out, and Baal Shin Tes, which surely is in fact the Baal Shem Tov, Ziyah, the Mishmanim Sheish Ba'olam Hein Heim, Shiyatsu Mizivig Oisa Halayla, Zeh Toichen Devarim, and that's where the passage ends in the Sefer Yom Tzachayim. So it turns out that the added line, Lefiza Saramai, so it's not the other reason, it's this reason. That is an addition that's not in the original, and it's an addition that already appears in the Sefer Mare HaYolodim. And I'll give some background now on who all of these people are, not Reb Chaim Palachi, because that's basic enough. But Reb Chaim Palachi is quoting Reb Sadia Halevi Baal Sefer Nevei Tzedek. Who is that? So that's Reb Sadia Halevi, who's his family name, or maybe even his nickname, his personal name, I'm not sure. He's known as Mercado. And he has a sefer. He's talking known by his sefer. Sefer was Nevei Tzedek on the Rambam, was printed in Saloniki, Tafresh Aleph. And he actually has a Hebrew Wikipedia article, Sadia Halevi Ashkenazi, and they're right. Sadia Halevi Mechunim Mercado was born in Tafkuf Chavches, 1767. Was a Paisik, one of the Rabbanim of Izmir in Turkey. He was born in Izmir to his father, Abraham Halevi, and it goes through the different details, biographical details of his life, not Negeh here. We don't know exactly when he passed away, but he surely had passed away before the year Tafresh Aleph, when his Sefer Nevei Tzedek was printed, because he's already mentioned there, Bevirchas, those who have passed away. And in fact, his granddaughter married the son of Reb Chaim Palachi, so there's that connection there as well. And they had a connection. Reb Chaim Palachi, Taka quotes him a lot in his farm. And in fact, in Wikipedia, they actually mentioned this quote that Reb Chaim Palachi has an interesting quote that Bekisvi HaKodesh Reb Sadia Halevi, and they quote the same quote that Reb Chaim Palachi quotes from Reb Sadia Halevi. So that's who he was. That's what we know about him. Interesting is that his kinui was Ashkenazi. Obviously, he was born in Izmir, so it's mashma that he lived more or less as a Sephardi, but he had the kinui Ashkenazis, which suggests that someone somewhere along the way in his family had immigrated from Ashkenazi lands to that area and had then received the appellation Ashkenazi. Like I said, it's cute that Wikipedia is actually quoting the same quote that we're discussing here. I did not find anywhere else, maybe I didn't search for it, but I didn't see anywhere else that Chaim Palachi quotes these Kisvei HaKodesh. So I don't know if we know anything else about what these Kisvei HaKodesh may have been and what their nature was and why a passage like this ended up there. But that's what we know. So that's the first source, Reb Sadia. And then the next source, of course, is Chaim Palachi, the next link in the chain. And the next link in the chain is the Sefer Mare HaYolodim. Sefer Mare HaYolodim is by Rebbe Fol Ochana. Fol Ochana also has a Hebrew Wikipedia article. He was born in 1850. He passed away in 1902. He was a Shadar from Tveria. He was born in Mekines in Morocco. He authored many Svarim. Born in Mekines, Min Aliyah. Had the nickname Rafal Hamalach. Was sent as a Shadar to Bukhara in Uzbekistan, and then later to Syria, to Iraq, to India, to North Africa, so sent to more Sephardi-coded areas, although I wouldn't call every location Sephardi per se, but the eastern lands. Other biographical details, and unfortunately he lost, back then, the child mortality rate, he lost children, and that apparently inspired him and pushed him to compose the Sefer Mare HaYolodim, which was a work that focused on remedies, trying to bring whatever knowledge he could offer to the masses to perhaps help prevent what had happened to him. So he had lost the children from his first wife, but he had a second marriage, and he had healthy children from that marriage. And there are additional biographical details there as well. You can actually find the text of Sefer Mare HaYolodim on the website of Project Ben Yehuda. They typed up the entire text for some reason, and you can find the text there, including this passage. I'll just point out that often there are those who are Mitzayin that it was printed in the year Tafish Samaches, which wouldn't shtim with the fact that Sefer Schools Yisrael, which quotes Mari Yeladim, was printed in Tafish Samachay. But if you look it up, if you dig a bit deeper, you'll find that Mari Yeladim was printed actually multiple times within a short span of time. It was printed Tafish Samach, Tafish Samachay, Tafish Samaches. So it seems like Rav Chana got the ball rolling. He printed Mari Yeladim in the Sephardic realm, and then the Sefer, the Ashkenazi work, Schools Yisrael, printed a few years later in the Ashkenazi realm, was using the Sefer Mari Yeladim and copied this passage from this Sephardic source into the Ashkenazi world. If you look in the Sefer Schools Yisrael, you search for Mari Yeladim, you'll see that it quotes Mari Yeladim more than 60 times. So it was definitely a prominent source that the Sefer Schools Yisrael was using. I'll point out that around in the same decade, in the Samachs, in the first decade of the 1900s, there's also another Sefer, Sefer Rafal HaMalach, by none other than Rabbi Yudel Rosenberg, who should be pretty famous to one and all. And also another work that collects schoolis and stuff of this nature. So it looks like this decade was like the golden era at the time for collecting and printing stuff of this nature. So what was interesting to me, having seen the letter of the Munkatcher and then digging a bit to understand what's going on here, so it seemed pretty interesting to me to discover that this passage in Sefer Schools Yisrael, which is an Ashkenazi Sefer and is being discussed by Ashkenazim, does not come from an Ashkenazi source, but came through a channel of no less than 3 Sephardim, Reb Sadia Halevi, via Reb Chaim Palachi, via the Mara HaYelodim. Although Reb Sadia himself does have the name Ashkenazi, and he is, of course, quoting from the Baal Shem Tov, but still, that's the channel of transmission. It's also fascinating, pretty interesting that this Reb Sadia Halevi was quoting anything b'shem the Baal Shem Tov, so that's interesting as well. It's just not what you expect, not what you would expect going into it. Now, we should acknowledge that there were limitations, there was censorship in the European lands at the time. So for all we know, maybe this Shmuel b'shem the Baal Shem Tov was very widespread orally. Maybe people spoke about it a lot, but it simply never made it into print in the decades between the Baal Shem Tov's passing and the Tafish Samachs, as opposed to the eastern lands where it would have been less of an issue, although Chaim Palachi's language, if you don't know what he's referring to, isn't necessarily super clear, so maybe that makes it easier to print. But as we know, in Islam, they do respect Isra Ish, so not sure if he could have written it too explicitly, but the way he wrote it, it seems like between where he lived and the way he wrote it, probably was fine. So that could be the reason why it never appeared in Ashkenazi sources during this period, only in this Sephardic source, these Sephardic sources. Still, I think it's notable and it's interesting chiddush. Now, with regard to this is not to say that the entire source for this Isser, we'll call it an Isser, not to say that the entire source only appears for the first time in Sephardic sources. We certainly have sources and proof for the prevalence of this minig, of this Isser, in Ashkenazi sources, but not all, but a portion of them were only printed recently. So let's say you have the Makar Chaim of the Chavis Yar, was only printed recently, and stuff like that. Also, this is a letter that Nittel Gabriel quotes from the Reb Tia Weil, also was only printed by Nittel Gabriel recently. So there's definitely enough evidence that the minig itself was prevalent and widespread in Ashkenazi world, and these Sephardic sources are only alluding to and citing this Ashkenazi practice. But still, it still seems like if you were living in 1905 or in 1925, if you were looking for an instance for a record of this minig in print, it would have been somewhat difficult to actually find anything in writing. So it seems like in this correspondence, the two options were either Sefer Schools Yisrael, quoting from this line of sources, or from the Sefer the Munkatcher mentions, which is Chupas Chasanim, which we'll get to. And in light of this, I want to point out another nekud, another chiddush, which I alluded to all the way at the beginning, which is that today it's very common to make a distinction and say, Nittel's for Ashkenazim, even if you observe Nittel, but it's for Ashkenazim. Those who came from European lands, got nothing to do with Sephardim from the Eastern lands. But here we see that no, this is Reb Chaim Palachi who printed it first. He's writing it to he's someone in Turkey writing it to a Turkish audience, and he's sharing this information. So presumably one can deduce that that would suggest that it was being observed to some extent in a land like Turkey. So that is a chiddush as well. Now, even if this this source suggests that it was observed to some extent, we can still be mechalek, make a distinction and say, what about, there's the meaning of not learning versus the inyan of zivug? Maybe the not learning would have made less sense, would have been less popular. Maybe the inyan of zivug was more intuitive, would have been more niskabel, possible. And Chaim Palachi is only citing the minig of the Gabe zivug, could be, but we can make other distinctions, we can theorize and postulate in other ways as well, but I'm acknowledging that. But bottom line, you have Chaim Palachi is writing this to his audience, so that definitely complicates the model by which it's just an Ashkenazi thing and of no interest, no concern to Sephardim. And what we also find here is already sort of an early link between the observance of the practice of Nittel with Chassidus, which comes across here because it's being attributed dafka to the Baal Shem Tov. Even though, as I already mentioned, we know the Menhagim predate Chassidus, but on the other hand, we all know today that basically, like I said, it's Chassidus that maintains and preserves some of these practices, particularly practices of this nature. And in fact, later when the Chassam Sofer, who wrote about Nittel, so he sort of accepted the not learning part, but he actually wrote more negatively about the no mikveh, etc. part. Right, it's a bit more sharp, essentially against it. So there were those who came afterwards who said, well, the way they'll phrase it is, the Chassam Sofer taka didn't all of it, but those who follow the Derech Chassidus. So if you're following it because you're a Chassam Sofer Yid, so I guess it's you can rely on the Chassam Sofer, it's not negayah to you. But if you're a Chassidus Yid, you're following the Derech of Chassidus, so presumably you should observe this restriction as well, because this is a part of it in the Hasidic world. I'll also mention, I can't not mention, that there is actually a late interesting Hasidic source from the year Tafish Samach Gimel, a certain little, I would say relatively little known Hasidic Rebbe, the Sasaver, who wrote a letter in Tafish Samach Gimel 1903 in which he denies the Shmuel B'Shem the Baal Shem Tov. He says, yeah, people say B'Shem the Baal Shem Tov, but it's not true. How does he know it's not true? Because he's a Talmud of his Zayda, and his Zayda was a Talmud of the Hashem of Bells, who was a Talmud of the so-and-so, who was a Talmud of the Maggid. So if the Baal Shem Tov said anything, I should know about it, which, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to, you can judge that claim yourselves. But that was his claim, that he's the gatekeeper of all Shmuas B'Shem the Baal Shem Tov, and if he didn't hear about it, then it can't be true. But he's, I think, a lone voice in the Hasidic world. Most of the Hasidic world, certainly told today, whether or not there's a clear chain of transmission in writing orally, it's certainly widespread within the Hasidic world to follow both, I believe, both Menhagim. Certainly they're not learning. Before I move on, I'll just make another observation about the language in Reb Chaim Palachi's Sefer. Chaim Palachi has a Sefer, has this lashon, Balayla shenoilad hanovi shalahem dekoiden loy kain to defenu ruach. What's this word dekoiden? Perhaps I would speculate that originally it actually was supposed to mention a name, hanovi shalem dekoiden so and so, and then perhaps it was omitted in print. And when the Marah Yeladim quotes the passage, the word dekoiden is still included, but in Sefer Schools Yisrael, who just copied and pasted from the Marah Yeladim, that word is missing, probably because it didn't seem to make sense, so they just deleted it. Although it is possible to say maybe it's dekoiden, like koire ani olav, that reference to them, it's those who would do it, like dekoiden like came to the defender. It's possible to try to read it different ways. but I don't know. It kind of looks like my first suggestion. Another option would be that somehow with the words "lake kain" to defend ruach, there's somehow a remez that I'm not seeing to Oisei Ish. Some, we know Shem Ishtach Lahavav Larik Mispalim Elo Yeshir. We know there's ways to be merames and hint to his name. So is there a hint to his name here? I don't know. Also, the lashon Hanavi Shalahem itself is interesting. Obviously, that's not a term that would be used in European lands, but I believe that it makes more sense in context in the Eastern lands, and so I believe that would be perhaps how the Muslims referred to Isaiah. I believe they referred to him as a prophet, so it would make sense that they would have written Hanavi Shalahem. So even though, like I said, the language is a bit ambiguous, but it seems like everyone who saw the passage understood what it was talking about. It's quoting the Baal Shem Tov. What are we talking about? No one has ever doubted the meaning of the passage. Okay, so that's all the School of Yisrael that Rav Shlomo Zucker was quoting to the Minchas Elazar, and he was asking something about it. And Minchas Elazar says, "Why are you quoting from the School of Yisrael? You should just quote from the Sefer that everyone quotes, the Chuppos Chasanim." So he seems to think School of Yisrael is not a chash v'makar, even though we saw the pedigree of the quote in the Sefer, but maybe the Minchas Elazar didn't see the whole chain of transmission. Maybe he just saw School of Yisrael, and maybe he thought School of Yisrael was not a chash v'sefer, it was beneath his dignity to react to discuss a sefer of such low caliber. Instead, Chuppos Chasanim to him was considered Machash Sefer. It was already quoted by Poskim. Even though technically speaking, School of Yisrael after quotes B'Shem Moshe, but again, I don't know if the Minchas Elazar actually saw the full quote and worked out the chain of transmission like we have done here. And again, you can go back and forth on it. It's not so important. So who is the Chuppos Chasanim? The Chuppos Chasanim is actually a very interesting author. It's not like he's just a straight-laced, regular Ashkenazi that a Munkatcher would quote. The Chuppos Chasanim is actually Reb Rafal Mildola, who was later the Rav of the Sfardim in London. And he has both a Hebrew Wikipedia article and an English Wikipedia article, a bit more famous individual. Chacham Rafael ben Moshe Chizkiah Mildola, born in 1754, passed away in 1828, was the Rav of the Spanish-Portuguese community in London, and this is Wikipedia telling you the top two facts. Rav of London, and the author of Hilchos Hanisuim Chuppos Chasanim. Now, he actually authored many svarim, but the most famous one is Chuppos Chasanim, which was printed in Tafkuf Nun Vav, 1796, which was reprinted many times. In 1805, about 10 years later, he moved to London to be the Chacham, the Reish Kehilas Yudei Sfar de Portugal. And for those who are interested in the Jewish history in England, so the details of the shul and etc. are probably of interest. He was a very dominant figure in the Sephardic community, but also in the Ashkenazi community, and he had a good connection with the Ashkenazi Rav at the time. He also had his connections with Benjamin Disraeli and his father, Isaac. He corresponded with many Jewish and Christian scholars, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and others. So quite an interesting figure. Makes more sense in the context of the Sephardim of London, not so much your average Ashkenazi Rav. He wrote other chiburim as well. He has a sefer on the Avodah Yom Kippurim and others. He has, they say, he has a sefer Derech Hamuna with his educational, pedagogical approach, and where he apparently emphasizes that it's important. Obviously Torah is extremely important, but he also emphasizes the need for knowledge of other areas of wisdom. He also wrote a number of kunteresim. For example, a kunteres Ein Eis Lachshois, which was about a mini controversy over how to pronounce the word matzu in Shmois, V'loi matzu mayim. His son attests that his father wrote many other chiburim that were not published, and which are not accounted for today. So quite the interesting figure. Figured that we should emphasize it a bit since the Munkatcher is promoting him. You can find the Ein Eis Lachshois on Hebrew books and elsewhere. You can also check out the English Wikipedia. There they mention another interesting detail I found of interest about the musicality in shuls, music and shul is always a topic that interests me. The history has many aspects and dimensions that are not very well known. So they mention here, Moldola looked as well to ensure the dignity and proper execution of synagogue prayers, and he introduced what has become one of the most distinctive and appreciated qualities of the Spanish and Portuguese service, its choir. As an Italian notes one biographer, Moldola had been fond of music and had been the first person to introduce a choir into the London synagogue. So from other discussions of music in Judaism and in Tefillah, Italy does tend to be the ground zero. So it's interesting to see how it spread at the time from Italy to London by way of Rav Moldola. Not sure if we stated clearly where he was from. I think I missed the detail where he was from, but he was from Italy. I don't have the exact detail in front of me, but that is important. It is key to our discussion. He was from Italy, so a Sephardic family in Italy, and then ended up in London. So, like I said, it's interesting that this is a Chashiv Malka to Minchas Elazar, but it was printed quite a while before. It was printed in Tafkuf Nun Zayin, and as Minchas Elazar said, Poskim already were citing it, maybe even specifically with regard to this topic. And see later, I will cite from a Sefer Yad Ephraim and the Makaris that Yad Ephraim has been citing to. B'chlal, it's interesting. What is the Chuppas Chasanim? What type of sefer is it? It seems like it was written sort of as a handbook for Chasanim. Sort of like, this is you're getting married, you're engaged, you're getting married. This is going to be the handbook for you. It's going to cover all aspects of marriage. So in that sense, it kind of has a bit of a modern ring to it. It's not. There are other pre-modern modern works that I can draw attention to in this manner, but this sefer as well seems to belong to that category, which is interesting as well. So getting to the point, what does this have to do with the topic at hand? So in this sefer, part of the handbook for Chasanim is Hilchas Tznius. Hilchas Tznius meaning referring to matters relating to the act of zivug, and that section alone would probably be interesting to go through on some future occasion. But if you look there in the sefer, and I'm using the tfus. If you look at page Ayin Daled Aleph, he writes, "U'chukas yirei Hashem v'chosh v'shmoi afarish poi seder koilel l'zmanim hamutarim v'asurim bezivug k'fi ma she'osa askamasenu im kol ha'chavedim mitoich divrei harav." As we'll see later, this is not actually his own language. I'll tell you in a second who he copied it from. But essentially, we know that the Arizal turned the Inyan HaZivug into almost a part of the Avodah of Kabbalah, those who follow the path of Kabbalah. So the act of Zivug is seen as a spiritual act, and therefore there are times when it's mutter and encouraged, as it's the act itself is part of the Seder HaAvodah of the day. You have to be misdavig and be mamshach, whatever hamshachas go along with that. Or you're being poil an equivalent zivug l'mayla. And then there are times where it's aser, and the Arizal will explain why zivug is aser, because it doesn't shtim with what's happening l'mayla at the time. A recent example I saw of this is with regard to the night of the Seder, the night of Pesach. The Arizal has a whole mahalach to explain what's going on l'mayla, the night of Pesach, and a zivug does not fit in with that, and that's its own topic for another time. I'll just mention a detail that stuck in my mind, which is that with regard to that, one of the Makaitis that discusses it mentions that some had the practice, maybe the Arizal himself, the Chaim Vital mentions that there were some that had the practice to stay up the whole night of the Seder for this reason, meaning that staying up as opposed to going to bed is sort of a way of keeping away. And there are many days of Yom Tovim. It's very common that days of Yom Tovim are Asr Beziva according to Arizal. And I have thought about it and speculated about whether the minhagim that we're familiar with of staying up certain nights may have something to do with that, even though it's never stated as such, but whether there's a link between staying up all night and nights that are Asurim Bezivuk. So at any rate, this was very influential, and many wish to follow the ways of the Arizal and the Adei Mazah, the Svarim, especially the more Hasidic background. Let's say for Kadam Tanavcha, which is a sefer on Yoni Zivug, a contemporary sefer. So somewhere in the sefer, he divides it into levels and tiers of which darga you feel you're up to. but somewhere in there he definitely lists these dates, these days. So this Sefer by of Moldola, despite his interesting, eclectic background and interests, but he still also belonged to a circle who were may have been interested in following these Hanhagas of the Arizal. So he copies the list. And I didn't copy the entire list here, but it's Yom Tov, things like that. But then, at the end of the list, you find the following passage. It says, Isha she'era leil tfilasa beleil nadal, and the word seems to appear here in its Italian form, which is what the day is in fact called in Italian. Loit is dakik labaila ba'oisei alayla, so even though it's her leil tvila, it's pasha the night, which is supposed to toivel. Loit is dakik labaila ba'oisei halayla, she should not be with her husband at night. And it adds to voice Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid as the source. And we're going to dig into that. So the Minchas Elazar alludes, if you remember earlier, Minchas Elazar said that, the Schools of Israel calls it one thing, the Chuppah Chasanim calls it something else, but it's all the same thing. So as Minchas Elazar said, indeed, Nadal is another name for Nittel, or as I mentioned earlier, it's essentially really the same name in Italian, without the derogatory twist to it, as far as I can tell. So the Chuppah Chasanim, who, as we said, was Sephardic from Italy, still included this. I guess he's attributing it to Tzavos Yehuda Chassid. So there is the Ashkenazi attribution, but he's citing it as a general minig for Ashkenazim and perhaps even for Sephardim. Now the question is, does it actually say in Tzavos Yehuda Chassid? It clearly doesn't say it in the standard text of Tzavos Yehuda Chassid, and that's what we're going to dig into later. But what do we see from this? What we see from this is that in addition to the source that the Minchas Elazar dismissed, the source that the Minchas Elazar embraced is also Sephardic. Although again, he is quoting the Chassid, so it ultimately always goes back to Ashkenazim, but the Sefer itself is Sephardic. And again, it seems like there's evidence that Sephardim, in this case Western Sephardim in the Western lands, may have also been makpid on Nittel, or specifically Zivug, Beleil Nittel, although sometimes in these discussions there's mention made of which rule do you live under? Do you live in a Christian land or live in an Islamic land? So in this case, they would have been living in Christian lands, so then the Ashkenazi Sephardi division doesn't really hold up so well if you're a Sephardi who lives in European lands. Of course, Sephardim themselves originate from Spain, which was also and it's the last, well, depending obviously which region of Spain, etc. But as we know, the land they were expelled from was a Christian land. So Sephardim technically don't hail from Islamic land per se, but from a Christian land. Obviously, the history of Spain is more complex than that. But that's just to say that Ashkenazi Sephardi, that divide doesn't really necessarily hold up. Certainly for those who lived in Christian European lands, but as we saw earlier, perhaps even in Muslim lands. Now, who was the Chuppah Chasanim actually quoting from? So at some point I realized that actually that whole shtickle, that whole section in Chuppah Chasanim is actually quoted from none other than everyone's favorite Sefer, which is the Sefer Chemdas Yamim, which we are not going to get into. And in fact, 2 pages earlier in Chuppah Chasanim, he actually writes, Sha'or has hardest ala zivug me harav chai, from the Baal Chemdas Yamim. So all of those pages actually quoted straight from the Chemdas Yamim, and that, including that entire list and the introduction, Lachukas Yirei Hashem, V'cheshu Ishmoi, also Eskomoseinu, Kol HaChaveru, T'Ktuvi Harav, that's Chemdas Yamim language. But the one line, it's actually not just the one line. There's towards the end of that list, there is like half a paragraph enclosed in parentheses. Much of it is about another point, another date, and then at the end there's this line, Isha she'er alel tefilasa b'lo nadal. So that would appear to all be an addition of the Chuppah Chasanim himself, and not from the Chemdas Yamim. It's not in the Chemdas Yamim. So now, having properly, that was all based on the one line in the Minchas Elazar saying, Schools of Israel, Chuppah Chasanim. So now that we figured out what that's all about, so now let's go back and take a look at what the Minchas Elazar actually says. So the beginning was quoting that, quote that. But what was the question? What was the discussion? What did Reb Shlomo Tzukar want to know? So Minchas Elazar continues and says, "Ve'em lizar gam achri chatzois shaluni kvar al kacha ba'ashivaisi la'achmer v'chiyika piruka l'sakanta." If it's a sakana, you don't want to mess with the sakana. So I say you should be machmer even after chatzos. Mashakasav, you wrote to me that there's heter believe achri chatzos. The minig is you only refrain from learning till chatzos. After chatzos is fine, like we're doing right now. Zeh shiny. The learning is different. Why? What's the Minchas Elazar's proof? According to Arizal, every zivug, every day of the year should only be after chatzos. That's the appropriate time and not before. And the Chubas Chasan himself cites this because he cites the Hanhagas Lafi Arizal. So in that context, when the Chubas Chasan then says, not Nittel, and came Bal Karchach, Kavanos and Lizar Chatzos. So surely the Chubas Chasanim intended, you're following the Adrachas of the Arizal, you're already refraining the Chatzos, and now I'm telling you not Nittel, so surely that means after Chatzos as well. That was the Minchas Elazar's response, and that was his Raya. What's interesting is that for the Lubavitchers, of course, this is actually something the Rebbe quotes and addresses directly. If you look at Shulchan Menachem Chelik Vav, page Reish Mem Beis, they copy a letter there, which is originally printed in Igros Kodesh Chelik Yud Beis, Nissen Tafshin Tazayin. The name of who the letter was addressed to was omitted there. Would be interesting to know, but it doesn't appear there. But in this letter from Tafshin Tazayin, the Rebbe actually quotes this source, this kuntras, pretty directly. The Rebbe writes, "By Nagel Leil Nittel, Af Sheher Al Zel Chumra, the Sefer Darkei Chaim V'Shalom Siman Taftav Chav Hey, which is the Sefer of Munkatcher on Haggis, of the Munkatchers on Haggis. So in Darkei Chaim V'Shalom Siman Taftav Chav Hey, Shehevi Mi Sefer Zecher Tzaddik Levracha B'Shem Rav Tzaddik Chul Mi Munkatch." So Taka, we have this source L'Chumra. Avalei Shamati B'Zahir. I didn't hear. Of course, when he says that, he means from his father-in-law. I didn't hear a Hira one way or the other, so I can't tell you what my stance, what the Chabad stance, what the Chabad approach is to this question. The Rebbe says, it seems strange. What's the Yisrael to be Machmer? Presumably the same logic of if the minhag to refrain from learning is it was only until Chatzos, so why should this be different? I don't have the Sefer, which is really a kuntras, Zecher Tzaddik Levracha, to see. So the Darkei Chaim V'Shalom only quoted Bekitzer, the Maskana, and was Mitzayin, and the Rebbe didn't only had that, didn't have the source, didn't have the letter of the Munkatcher to see how the Munkatcher presented it. So the Rebbe didn't see the Munkatcher's specific raya, which we just saw just a few moments ago. The Rebbe continues. So the Rebbe starts off saying, "Tzarechim, why would you be machmer?" And the Rebbe continues and says, the problem is, if you're being Isaac and Oina, it's very important to have the proper thoughts, the purest, cleanest thoughts. Machshava pe'alas b'yaser, we know how important, what a role the machshava plays in this tchum. Yesh makam lachshus, maybe I can say it's the famous svara of the Rebbe. Yesh makam lachshus sheyal b'machshavta inyan ha'nittel. So because it's happening in Nittel after Chatzos, but you're thinking about it, it's on your mind. So it feels somewhat likely that you're going to sort of be thinking or battling the thought of Nittel. You're not supposed to think about Nittel. Try not thinking about Nittel on the night of Nittel. So that's not good. So that's not good. Even if you're busy thinking, no, not Nittel, bad Nittel, but you're still thinking about it, that's not good. Maybe that's the reason. It seems like the Rebbe was suggesting maybe that was the reason of the Munkatcher, which was not the reason of the Munkatcher, but that was the svara that the Rebbe came up with, a different svara. That's the Rebbe's suggestion. That's where the Rebbe's discussion of this matter ends. If you look at Shulchan Menachem and Haaretz, so you can see that they cite Chilukei Deis, is a dispute, an argument in Chabad as to what the takeaway from the Rebbe's letter is. Do you go with the Rebbe's Tzarech and you say that Dvarim, or do you go with Yesh Makam Lachshish? Which part is the Rebbe's real opinion? So you can check it out there and see what they're mitzayin to there. So that's pretty much it regarding the letter of the Munkatcher, but we still have more to discuss and unpack here. So first of all, I mentioned there's a Sefer Yad Ephraim. Yad Ephraim is a sefer written by Rabbi Ephraim Bilitzer, who was killed in the Holocaust. He wrote a chibur on the tzava of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. And if you look there in Ois Ayin Aleph, he cites this because he did a comprehensive job, and he noticed that there's this additional thing that's being cited and attributed to Tzavos Yehuda Chassid. I hope I don't have to introduce what the Tzavos Yehuda Chassid is. As we know, there was Yehuda Chassid, lived in Germany. I don't have the exact date, if it's the 1100s, the 1200s, but very, very early on, quite early on. And there's Sefer Chassidim, full of interesting teachings, and then you have specifically the Tzavah, which is a list of admonitions of don't do this, don't do that. A lot of them are very surprising, or you could say even strange, and all very controversial. And there's a lot of talk around the Tzavah. We know the Chabad Rebbeim themselves had their run into the Tzavah. I was definitely being oisik in it recently. I don't remember if it was something that I recorded or not. But there's definitely interesting material from the Tzemach Tzedek. There's also a sefer Shivim Tamarim on the Tzavah, written by someone from the Lubavitcher family, I could say Lubavitcher, Chabad Chassid back in Russia, where he quotes different shmuas with regard to the Tzavos Yehuda Chassid, B'Shem the Tzemach Tzedek, etc., and Shuvas written by the Tzemach Tzedek. So Tzavah casts a big shadow over the Ashkenazi world. So this Ephraim Bilitzer wrote a sefer Yad Ephraim, and he didn't only shtelzich and deal with the passages in the Tzavah, he also quotes this because it's cited elsewhere, B'Shem the Tzavah. And in the Ha'ara Chaf there, he writes, in the Tzavah zu loy matzasi b'svarim hamaviyim Tzavah Yehuda Chassid. I don't see it in this form that actually feature the Tzavah. But later, Paspadesh Sefer Chassidim, so there are two places you can find the Tzavah, either in the beginning of Sefer Chassidim, which is one traditional place you'll find it. There are also other chiburim that are maybe of a more eclectic nature, and we'll throw in the Tzavah as well, as we'll see shortly, as well as in addition. But it's not printed in any of the places where you might find the Tzavah. You won't find this thing about Nittel. Where did I find it? Chupas Chasanim. The Gamu was Sefer Shmiras HaNefesh, Hashem Yisrael, other chiburim that also seem to be focusing, like Schools Yisrael, but focusing more on the sakonis, the things just like in today's day and age of Shmiras HaGuf HaNefesh, so that genre. So you have Svarim of that genre, but also late Svarim, they were all quoting, copying this quote, which is attributed to Tzavos Yehuda Chassid. So the other friend doesn't know what to make of it. He says, V'ulai hishmitu hatzanzorim. Maybe Itaka really is a real passage in the Tzavah, but maybe the censors omitted it, which is a reasonable theory to consider. But he doesn't know. That's all he could come up with. Then he goes on. It's interesting. You look there. He talks about this. He calls it the B'chal. We're talking about Nittel and Chassidim. We have to at least acknowledge that there are different dates. There's the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic, the Western Christian calendar. We're not going to get into the whole history of it. At this point today, everyone follows the Gregorian calendar, but even though everyone uses Gregorian calendar day to day, but the Eastern Orthodox churches do follow the Julian calendar for religious dates. So that means that their observance of Nittel ends up being on what we now call January 6th or January 7th. So Yad Ephraim makes reference to there's the Yavonim and there's the Remeim. Those are the terms that he uses. And because he was really leaning towards the Yavonim, the original calendar. But now the Yavonim joined the Remeim, so now what? So he's a bit flummoxed by that question. He also mentions that there's one of the nicknames for this night. One of the nicknames for this night in Yiddish was the Blinde Nacht, the blind night, which seems to be some kind of derogatory take on maybe silent night is a term that we hear about in German would be Stille Nacht. So maybe it's a take on that. Instead of still, it's blind. Or maybe just Heilige Nacht or whatever term. It seems like it's a derogatory twist on an existing term. And it would be interesting to search through the academic stuff on Nittel to see if there's any additional insight into this term, but I came across it there in the Yad Ephraim. I also came across, when I was looking up Blinde Nacht, I saw there was actually, interestingly, someone by the name of Shimon Kronberg, who was a playwright, and among other things, He was around the 40s, and in 1941 he wrote a play for Nittelnacht, and he entitled it Blinde Nacht. So he was alluding to this term that was once still common, and even though he himself doesn't seem to be quite Haredi per se, but apparently that was a term he was familiar with, and it was a play focusing on the developments at the time, the direction Germany was already pretty deep into heading in. It was 1941, so he expressed his thoughts about the matzav at the time in a play he wrote called Blinde Nacht. It was not performed at the time. It actually was performed for the first time in Austria a few years ago in 2019, and there's a video of it somewhere on YouTube. But that's not really directly relevant, but it's something I came across once I came across the term Blinde Nacht. Anyway, so Yad Ephraim is an interesting source, going through some of these details to the best of his Havana. And he also has a Kuntres Achron on it, and then they reprinted a sefer recently. He also wrote a sefer called Teres Ben Noach. So when they reprinted the sefer Teres Ben Noach recently, they also, in Tafshin Samach Vav, they also included the Yad Ephraim, which is a smaller work on the Tzava, and there they combined everything he wrote on the topic. So I'm mentioning it because I did take a look at it in the process of going through this topic. Other Svarim, just a selection of other Svarim where you can see a bit of a discussion of this and of these Makairis. There's a sefer Itzer HaChakas, and I find it amusing. In light of the above, I find it amusing. He starts off with a whole shturim that this is only for Ashkenazim. This Svarim don't know about it. And this is often attributed to Rav Yosef in his Taras Abayis. Rav Yosef declares that Svardim know nothing about Nittel, the observance of Nittel, and I'll point out that, which is a common observation that I make, that Rav Yosef did hail originally from Iraq, which, if you think about the spread of the actual Sephardic diaspora in the Eastern lands and its impact on the Eastern lands, Iraq is pretty far. I'm not sure how many actual Sephardim made it as far as Iraq. So Rav Yosef is not actually coming from what I would call a real Sephardic milieu, as opposed to, which would be more like Turkey and lands perhaps like that. He's coming from a bit further away, but further off, and I think sometimes that reflects, that shapes his attitude towards Minhagim. It doesn't. My impression is that he doesn't really approach Sephardic Minhagim, Sephardic practice, the way someone who was born into a real, proper, strong Sephardic and original Sephardic diaspora community, how someone from there would probably approach things. So this Sefer Itzer HaChakas starts off quoting the B'Omer, starts with nothing about it, and then in his discussion later, he quotes the Sefer Yom Tzachayim. He's not Tzachayim Chaim Palachi, and he himself doesn't recognize the stira. If you're quoting the Sefer, if you're aware of the Sefer, you should notice that definitely is Sephardi. But you look there, Itzer HaChakas has a lot of Marmakaimis, and another sefer I saw that mentioned that discussed this point, that actually addressed this point head on, of Sfardim, is the Shut Orchesecha Lamdeni Chelik Zayin, printed just a few years ago, Tafshin Pei Aleph, Chaim Simenon Tes, where he tackles this question head on. On the one hand, the Rav Yosef says not for Sfardim. On the other hand, we have these Sephardic Makairis. So some people, just a few, have actually taken notice, have actually noticed these sources and have acknowledged it. His maskana there, I think, is ultimately that whatever Nishnagaya, that's not mice, it's not Nagaya to Sfardim, or whatever his exact reasoning is. I don't remember precisely, but at least I was happy to see that people are actually acknowledging and noticing that you have these Sfardim Makairis. Don't say it's not. It's nothing to do with Sfardim. That's not true. And if you search Yom Tzachayim, Nittel, you'll find a number of other Svarim that will cite some of these Makairis. But like I said in the beginning, I haven't yet found a sefer that actually lays it out properly, and even what we've done so far, just laying it out chronologically, Saj Alevi, Yom Tzachayim, Mara Yeladim, Skulas Yisrael, just saying those four sources in order, you'll find that there are enough Svarim that mix them up and say them in the incorrect order. This one says, and this one says, and this one says it, and it just really bothers me. Another source you might want to look up is the famous or the infamous Hilchos Nittelnacht. For those who are familiar with the Hilchos Streimon, Hilchos Kvittel, so one of his Svarim is Hilchos Nittelnacht. From the little I looked at it, it seems like it actually is a useful resource, despite the conceit, despite the concept behind the series, and that the fact that people find it amusing. You look at Hilchos Nittel, page Mem Gimel. He also emphasizes this point that on the one hand, Yabiyah or the Taras Abayis says that the Sfardim don't know about it, but it doesn't seem to be true because Sfardim did cite it, they did discuss it, and he cites this b'shem in a sefer called Choykuz Man, on Nida and Tevila from Tafshet Samach Beis. And I looked it up in Choykuz Man as well. It is in fact discussed there in Choykuz Man, page Reish Tazayin. However, later but an example of my gripe of how the sources are not cited in the proper order. Look in Choykuz Man, for example, he quotes Reb Sadia b'shem Shmiras HaNefesh and says V'huvu Dvarav b'Sefer Yimtzah Chaim. The Shmiras HaNefesh quotes Reb Sadia, and it's also cited in the Yimtzah Chaim, which just drives me crazy because that's obviously just completely backwards. Yimtzah Chaim is the original source, and Shmiras HaNefesh is probably 3 sources later, 3 hatakas later. So if you're able to write a sentence like that, obviously people writing Likutim, Malaktim, they can't necessarily even look up all the sources, and they're copying strings of Marmakim from each other, as we know, especially when you actually find a mistake in a Marmakim and you find it cited with the mistake in 20 different places. So that's an issue, but that's just an example that stood out as just being absurd. You clearly do not have a clear sense of the chronology and the Seder Shtalshlus of who quoted from who. And like I said, all the Sfarim here, to one extent or another, do this, and that's what we're here to, in part, to rectify. So they're talking Choykuz Man, and page Reish Zion, he makes this ha'ara on the Abi Aimer, on the Taras Abayis, and Ravad Yosef, and says, Adarabba, you see that it is Shach to Sfardim. So, and I think his maskana, the way he writes it there is not the Sfardim want to be Nizar, absolutely is Shaykh to Sfardim. That's how that particular sefer presents it. So after I'd gone through all these Makaris, I was looking around to see, is there anyone else who's talking about this aspect of it, the Sephardic aspect of this minig Isser Zivug Nittel. Now we'll move on a bit to other Italian sources, because we mentioned earlier the Chubas Chasanim is an Italian Sephardi. But if you look in the Sefer Choykuz Man, for example, he quotes a number of other sources from Italy that are rare, that you find in fewer Sfarim that are Malakat, the stuff. Although, like I said, every Makar you'll find cited in a couple of the contemporary ones. So, for example, he quotes the Sefer Gur Aryeh on the Shulchan Aruch. And he also quotes the Zecher David, of Reb David Zakus Zakudo, so for example, Zecher David, the way Zecher David writes it, and we'll get to somewhat greater length in a moment, but the Zecher David writes that Hagoyel, with Rosh Tevis, Hagoyel, B'yud, B'yer Deya, Simon Kosadik Chas, wrote that Shekasa B'tzavos B'yud Chasid, Sheisha She'era Leil Tfilosa B'leil Leidos Oisra Ish, Loitas Dakik L'bayla B'oisa Halaylo. So instead of writing the word the Nittel, he turns it into Ornadal. He writes B'leil Leidos Oisra Ish, so pretty explicit. So the Zecher David is quoting it b'shem Hagoyel. Who's the Goyel? Goyel clearly is Rosh Tevis for the Gur Aryeh. And what we're seeing here is that it's also being quoted b'shem Tzavos B'yudah Chassid. So actually, as I try to look up every single source. If you look in the Gur Aryeh, where the Zecher David is assigned to, it's talking there in Shulchan Aruch Yodeis Mekos Halichas, which is towards the end of Hilchos Nida. It's a Daf Reish Yud Tes, Daf Reish Yud Tes Amud Beis in the Gur Aryeh. And Taka on that simon, there's a ha'ara in the Gur Aryeh. He writes, "Kasa b'tzavos b'yudah chassid she'isha she'eret tefilasa b'leil nadal lo'itas dakik l'bayla ba'iseh halayla." So, in fact, it would even appear that perhaps the Chubas Chasanim actually copied his passage directly from the Gur Aryeh, because the language looks identical. I didn't see anybody state this clearly either. So that's another aspect here of working out the chronology and the evolution and the transmission, is that the Chubas Chasanim, we worked out the transmission of the Yimtzah Chaim and the Schools Yisrael, that whole channel. Where did the Chubas Chasanim get it from? It would look like he may have gotten it from the Gur Aryeh, because it's the same language. But more on the Tzavah B'yudah Chassid and whether such a Tzavah exists or not, we'll get to later. Who the Gur Aryeh was, you have to be Mekatzer a little bit, but the Gur Aryeh is someone by the name of Reb Gur Aryeh Halevi Finzi, I believe is how it's pronounced. which was a well-known Jewish family in Italy. So he passed away in the year Tafnun Zayin. So the Chashiva Italian Rav in the 1600s, and he passed away Tafnun Zayin, which is the end, right there at the end of the 1600s. And you look through the Tshuvas of his era, you'll see his name a lot. Also Isaac in Kabbalah. Chida mentions him in a number of places. Chashivas, he mentions the Sefer Gur Aryeh in Shem Agdolim, Merechas Gedolim is Gimel Gur Aryeh. Hagoy Salkol Shulchan Aruch Nitbusu Mantava Sviv Shulchan Aruch V'Hem Harav and Rav Rab Gur Aryeh Alevi Echad Merabani Mantava Bisman Haramaz. In fact, this Chibur was not printed b'chayav. It was printed after he passed away. It was printed by his Talmud and his family in Mantava in the year Tuf Pei Beis, Tuf Pei Gimel. So that would be roughly 1722, 1723. So we would say that's about 25 years after he passed away. So that's another important source in tracing this Italian formulation of it, attributing it to Tzavas Yehuda Chassid. Another Italian sefer that I came across, not mentioned in the Chayk Uzman, I don't think, but I came across it, and then I found it cited in other svarim, is the sefer Mesgeres HaShulchan by Reb Menachem Azaria something Castelnuovo. One of the last traditional Rabbanim in Italy. His sefer was printed in the year Taf Reish. And after Kufnun Ches Amar Aleph, it seems to track very similarly with the Sefer Chubas Chasanim. He has the whole list there of all the days, according to Arizal. Although it looks like he may have copied it straight from the Chemdas Yamim. But then at the end of the list from the Chemdas Yamim, he also adds the additions of the Chubas Chasanim, including this. He quotes also that but then he also adds another line. He says, "Ubesaina, Firenze, Levarno, Upadava, Leishamati Shiniz Haram." So here he's actually saying, the Svarim say it, but in the cities I've been in, I haven't seen anybody actually observe it. And this is an important rule to keep in mind, when studying the minhag, is that you can't always be medayik. If something is not mentioned in Svarim, it doesn't mean that it wasn't practiced. It could be that it was a very widespread practice and it just never got mentioned in Svarim. That's very, very possible. There are good examples of this. But the opposite is also true. Something could be mentioned in Svarim, but it doesn't mean that anyone's actually observing it. So, for example, in this case, I myself am qualifying, even though I can show you Svardish Svarim, Italian Svarim, that are citing this practice for Nittel. I will concede, I will admit that this doesn't necessarily prove how widespread it was. So, for example, Mr. Shulchan is piping up and saying, I'm copying it, I'm pasting it, but I'm just going to let you know that I haven't seen anyone observe it. But he lived already in Taf Reish, that's already the mid-1800s, so things could have also changed. Perhaps in the 1700s it was more widely observed, and by the time he's writing, Italian Judaism was kind of on the wane anyway. So, but just for the sake of being upfront and clear and straightforward, so that's what he says. And look further in Hilchos Nittel. It's probably more information there as well. But that's about as much time as we can devote to these contemporary Svarim who also touch on what we've touched on so far. And another place to look would be the Sefer Dar Malaktim. For those who are familiar, Dar Malaktim is very interesting work. So Dar Malaktim, Yer Dedeya, Seven Kufim Ches, is where he has all the Nittel stuff, and he quotes a lot of these Makairos there as well. Now, one of the Svarim we just cited from Italy, we mentioned the Chubas Chasani, we mentioned the Gur Aryeh, we also mentioned the Zecher David. Now, the Zecher David, for those who may need to be reminded, Zecher David is a sefer that goes on at tremendous length about the Bris. And included in that, it goes on at the tremendous length about the inyan of Vachnacht. And, Vachnacht right now is an inyan Shazman Grama. I'm going to, Baruch Hashem, going to likely be engaged in it quite soon. But so Zecher David is definitely the go-to sefer when it comes to this topic. So works out that it's included here in our discussion, in our presentation. Just a quick, David Zakas also has a Hebrew Wikipedia article, and they say David Zakas. Zakas is in English and Italian is Kudo. Lived from 1778 to 1865, so also from the relatively late Italian Rabbanim. He was a Rav in Modena in Italy, and what is big sefer is Zecher David, 3 Chalakim, Taimim and Hagim Mitzvahs B'Des Milah, and other stuff. It's printed in Tafkuf Tzadik Zayin, 1837. Um, so the question is, in my case, this is when it's with whatever's negaya to me is that the nittel and nachnacht are not coinciding, so I don't have this issue. But Zecher David, who writes at great length about nachnacht, writes about this issue, this concern. What happens if Vachnacht and Nittel coincide? Vachnacht, you're staying up the whole night and learning. Nittel, you're staying up the whole night or not learning. So how does that go together? So in Zecher David, but specifically the new reprinted Ahavat Shalom edition, Chelik Aleph, Maimer Aleph, Perek Lamed, page Reish Daled, and if you look in the footnote there, they say that the following passage only exists in one particular copy of the first print, meaning we often find with old Svarim that one sefer that was printed in 1 year could exist in different forms, different variations, because however long it takes to play around and change the plate for a page, you could do that. So one sefer could be printed in different forms that could be shinuyim from one copy to another. The following passage is found in a particular copy from this tfus, but it's missing in other copies from the same print. Apparently, the censor caught up to it, or you could speculate what happened, but it's clearly not in many copies, and apparently was not in the copies that were widespread. But they have restored this passage. I'm going to go through the passage of the Zecher David. He says as follows: Fia minig shemimei ketem kadmasa. Noegim shleilumud belil leidas oisya ish. So gam made a laila shekoidim yem hamilos. What if it's vachnacht or whatever he called it? So I'm not going to get into the name. Nimnoim atamid chachamim leilich beveis hanar lases halimur hana keniskalael. So he attests in his circle that if vachnacht and nittel coincide, they do not go and sit together to learn. But loy davar eku. It's not an empty thing. Kishamati she'asu kein aravim. A first mechasid makubal of David Katz, Zal Zia, v'achav hagoyim pe'erdreinu or b'shmal Katz Zal Zia. So you had these chashuva rabbanim that confirmed that the minig is that you don't do vachnacht on nittel. Margul b'fiyim lema at the time of the milsahu mishom le'sachsem shar b'dishoy. And how do they explain b'chlal? How do they explain the union of not learning? They said it's like sachsim shar b'dishoy. The hainu shebeish litzah klipa v'tikbeiras shalah. Ainless nagid kenegdo b'kedusha ulevakish lahashpila adarabah shavki laravyo d'midanafshei nafel. If that's their time of power, so you don't fight it, you just step aside and let them fall themselves. But so also this kabbalistic type of explanation of approach relating to the klippus. He says, well, I don't have to strengthen what they said. Puk chazi, Hashem razal. I don't know if there's a typo in my transcription of it's Lagoy or Lanu. Shagam Malach Mazali Barakia Nitseach Va'ela. So he bolsters this idea by saying that this is true about a birthday Bechlal. We know that the day of a birthday is Taka Yom Tov. It's a good day for the Bala birthday, and his Malach goes and wins. He's surely alluding to Amalek. We know the Chazal about Amalek and other sources like that. He says, "An lekamon," with regard to Yom Leidas Moshe. So hine kikein gamzel umazel asalikim b'bnei adam shnitmu betuma ubetzila hem yeshvim ba'de b'yem hulada shalahem he misayadas b'chol teikav v'omitz v'omitz yesem mishar yomes hashana. So this is Nittel, you're celebrating the birthdays, so Zicher, Azoloi is Goiver, Azoli Oila, so that's the Keichas HaTumah or Mizgaber. So you have this rule, you don't fight it, you don't counteract it, you step aside, you stay away. That's his formulation of Nittel B'chlal. You can see that this is right because the Gerai, and this is the passage that we quoted earlier. The Meshakos of Agoyel, the Gerai writes in Yerdei Kosav Shekos of Tzavas Yehuda Chosish Ish Sherelil Tvilas Ability to say Ish like this Dakla by the way Salaylat Khan behind the timer La Nias Daiti Nida. So the two things, the Tumah and Hagam, are connected. Same premise. The Tumah is strong, and the Chitzanim are at a high point, at a strong point at that point. So they can negatively impact and harm this bia. And maybe the child will also end up being from their side. But it's going to cause a great destruction. The toiv heder davar mimetzias ra. Better to have nothing. Better to not have this union at all. The lack, the absence, is better than creating something bad. So the David Zakas, using his own methods, his own tools, essentially came and articulated pretty much everything that those who follow these manhagim know. So it's interesting also to see it from this other source, which, like I said, isn't really known, isn't really cited, because it only was really printed in a place that people could find it in the last, whatever date I said, the last, whether it's 10 years or 20 years, but fairly recently. But then he adds, but the Mishmeres Chatzos, that's for the first Mishmeres, those who would come before Chatzos Vachnach, they're canceled. But Mishmeres Chatzos Laila, they taka come, and he's describing a minute where a whole group comes to the base of Yeldan and Email to learn. So they come, but Inam Aschilam Limudam Ad Achar Chatzos, but they taka wait till after. Because then the Tumas Masma'atas Vayelachas Veina Oid Bekoicha K'may Koidem. And he's mitzayin also to a discussion elsewhere about Hishan Leil Hishan Rabba, which is also a big mysterious night. This is the hours before Chatzos. I believe he explained at great length why it's important. You need to give the protection to the Yel Danimel. So where does all of that rationale go? What's the protection? What protection is in place until Chatzos? That even though we saw clearly that this Yesod not to learn, our minute not to learn, it's not included. And then he goes on along those lines, but that's what he says. You could say tell. So that's also very interesting on a number of levels, both with regard to the fact that he quotes this particular Guraye, which was relevant directly to our discussion, but also his entire treatment of Nittel and his statement that it's the minig, and the way he explains it is also quite interesting, remarkable, and highly obscure. So happy to put the spotlight on it here. And like I said, no one has done a proper likud to my. If someone had done the likud already, then I would quote directly from there, or I would not do the shir at all because someone already did the work. But I'm doing this because I did not see anybody present this properly, not clearly and not even correctly, as opposed to getting the chronology wrong. So up until this point in the presentation, I thought that the big chiddush here would be these Sephardic Makairis, these unexpected Makairis, Sephardic, Italian. I thought maybe that would even be the title, the headline of this year. But then I kept digging and I found something, I don't know if it's even more interesting, but certainly equally as interesting. And that's regarding the Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. What is the story here? So we saw so far 3 Italian Makairis that we know that the Minchas Elazar approved of the Chuppos Chasanim, which is one of the Italian Makairis. But we saw that the Chuppos Chasanim is part of a chain as well. The 3 Makairis that quote B'Shem Tzavas Yehuda HaChassid. The most common, most famous is Chuppos Chasanim from Tavkuf Nun Vav. But we also saw that the Zecher David in Tavkuf Sadak Zayin is quoting from the Guraye, which was printed in Taf Pei Beis, Taf Pei Gimel, but he passed away before Taf Nun Zayin, so it's probably written beforehand. By the way, I saw some sefer says a pshitus that the Guraye is written in the Shins, which is simply not true. So we have 3 Svarim that are all quoting of B'Shem Tzavos Yehuda HaChassid, and yet the Yad Ephraim earlier that we quoted correctly pointed out that it doesn't seem to appear in the Tzavah. And he was speculating, maybe that it really is a real passage, but it was censored. Now, for example, if you look in the famous classic article, like I mentioned, with Professor Mark Shapiro on Nittel from 1999, he touches on it, he brushes against the topic a little bit. Looking in footnote 15, he cites the Chuppos Chasanim, and he says that it's a mystery that we don't understand why the Chuppos Chasanim is being mitzayin to Yehuda HaChassid. Yehuda HaChassid said no such thing. It would also appear that Professor Shapiro was not aware at the time of the Gur Aryeh, because he seems to, when it comes to he's coming at it from the angle of what's the marker for Isser Zivug, and he says the marker is Chuppas Chasanim. Chuppas Chasanim says B'Shem Yudah Chassid, but it's not. So, like this, that it's the Chuppas Chasanim. So it seems like he didn't know about the Gur Aryeh, which is an earlier marker, also very chashva marker. And probably for 1999, he was probably relying on whatever the Sifri Malakdim up until that point had been Malaket. And obviously today that has doubled and tripled and expanded. But no tinus on him, of course. And obviously I'm working with a whole different set of tools here. But that's as far as Mark Shapiro got in 1999. Chuppas Chasanim, Yudah Chassid, can't be Yudah Chassid, so the Chuppas Chasanim was the marker. But then I came across a more recent academic article from 2013. It also touches on this Chuppas Chasanim. This is an article called "The Ghost in the Privy: The Origins of Nittelnacht and Modes of Cultural Exchange" by Rebecca Scharbach. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Wallenberg. You can find the article on academia.edu. It's an interesting article. I saw people were actually citing it and quoting it today. I came across it a few weeks ago when I was looking into this. So she writes the following. I'm going to quote her, including the language that she uses. She writes as follows, page 343, 344 of the pages of that article, which is part of some larger journal or book. The restrictions on sexual relations on Christmas Eve can also be traced to the first decades of the 18th century, although this has not been documented until now. Researchers were previously unable to find a written reference to a practice that predated Rafal Moldola's Chuppah Chatanim in 1797. In Chuppah Chatanim, Moldolo claims to have seen the prohibition in the ethical will attributed to Judah the Chassid, who died in 1217, Germany. However, early German editions of Judah the Chassid's ethical will include no such statement, and she references Shapiro, Shapiro's article. As a result, scholars have concluded that the reference to this practice that appears in modern printed editions of the ethical will was interpolated on the strength of Moldolo's assertion, meaning if you'll find it in the Tzavah now, that's because someone added it because they saw Chuppas Chasanim, not vice versa. So that was where things were standing. She comes and adds the following chiddush. She says, as it turns out, the solution is somewhat more complicated. Allusions to the custom were indeed interpolated into the text of the ethical will, but not in modernity. The first references to the custom of refraining from sexual relations on Christmas Eve actually appear in northern Italian editions of Judah the Chassid's ethical will from the beginning of the 18th century, the very editions to which Moldola himself would have been exposed during his rabbinical training and early pastoral work in the region. Thus, one such text from 1718 reads, a wife who performed ritual immersion on Christmas Eve should not permit her husband to sleep with her. Yehuda HaChassid, Savas Yehuda HaChassid, Venice, Stamparia Bragadina, 1718, page 27. So, Pile Plan, that seems pretty remarkable. So she found a copy of Savas Yehuda HaChassid, printed before the Chuppas Chasanim, that contains such a passage. She still missed, as of 2013, she's still missing that there's an earlier source, that is the Gur Aryeh and the Shulchan Aruch. And on the one hand, the Gur Aryeh was printed in Taf Pei Beis, Taf Pei Gimel, it's the 1720s, which is a few years after the Tzavas B'Dachos that she's mentioning. But actually, we've already mentioned that he passed away a few decades earlier. So he surely wrote it a few decades earlier. So that already complicates whether 1718 is truly the first source, the way she's expressing it so simply, that it's the 1718 edition to Chuppas Chasadim. That's the pipeline, but we'll see about that in a moment. Now, at first, I couldn't find the print that she was describing. I really wanted to find the print, but then, as I was going through this material again today, I found it by searching the National Library of Israel's catalog. You can find it, and they link there as well to Hebrew Books and HebrewBooks.org as well. You can find it's under the title Tzavas Rabbeinu Yehuda Chassid. It's book number 19,500 in Hebrew Books, so it should be easy to find. This is the 1718 edition. Now, what is this actual work? Right, Tzavas Yehuda Chassid itself is pretty short, so that Yad Ephraim said it could be at the beginning of the Sefer Chassidim, or it could be part of other works. What work is this Tzavah included in? This is actually part of a particular work by the name of Yesod HaTshuva that was printed then. Yesod HaTshuva is an interesting work. mostly obscure and forgotten today, but was once upon a time one of those popular svarim. You have that pretty often, a popular sefer at a certain era that then becomes completely obscure. You say that tshuva is a kind of handbook for tshuva, and it's about this edition. It's roughly 24 pages, 69 samach tes seifim. Of those, 64 are mamish tikunei tshuva, and I'll cite a few examples because I find it pretty interesting. Number one, haba ala pnuya, pretty all arichas over there about haba ala pnuya. Gimel is haboyel nachris. Vav is hamanashik noshim. Yud is neshikas ishtoinida. Yud aleph is haritzeach haverei. Yud dalet is hamagbiya yodei al haverei. Vav is hashecheves al bana, a mother who unfortunately chas v'shalom smothers a child in her sleep, which was apparently, unfortunately, a common occurrence, common enough to be included. To Zayin Hamaka Ishtoi, that gets a seif. Chav Aleph Hamadaber B'Beis HaKnesses, Chav Beis HaMalshin, Laman Aleph Hamanabel Piv. Mem Hey is Hachedem Sha'asu B'Inyan HaMachol. Did you know there's a chedem against mixed dancing? That itself is a very interesting topic. And many other passages as well. Some of them are mamish tikkun tshuva with the prescribed tiniest, the way the old Ashkenazi list of tikkun tshuva used to work. Some of the passages are more just shtiklach musar, saying don't do that. Like Maka Ishta just says Maka Ishta, it's bad, don't do that. So you have a mix, but that's the nature of this short work. And there are after Sif Samardal, there are another additional few seifim as well, related topics, related material to Sif Samachtas. And then Sif Ayin, what is Sif Ayin? Sif Ayin is the entire Tzavas Yehuda Chassid in one long shot without numbering of Isis Ifim. There's one long block of text. That's Sif Ayin. And that was how the Sif, you say that Shuvah was printed. And of course, Tikkun Shuvah always gets me excited because this has tremendous tie-in to the Alter Rebbe's Yigaras HaTshuvah, what the Alter Rebbe was addressing, where the Alter Rebbe was coming from, what was going on at the time. The whole history of Ashkenazi Tikkunei Shuvah is also fairly invisible to most of us today, and it's something that needs to be uncovered and properly understood to understand where Chassidus was coming from, where the Alter Rebbe was coming from. So you say that Shuvah is a great indicator, a great indication of this, because this is actually a very popular format, meaning you have more, you have longer, more serious, lofty svarim. Here you see that there was literally a popular handbook, just a couple of, like a kuntrus, a couple of pages long. It was like your go-to encyclopedia or index of all the Avedas. Did an Aveda, you look it up, you have it right there on your shelf, or under your or under your bed, or under your pillow. You had the list of the 64 Avedas. So that itself is quite interesting. So if you look in, so this is the edition printed in 1718. Which she doesn't state clearly, but that's what it is. So in this edition of Yisrael Tshuva from 1718, I don't know why she says unnumbered. I don't know what copy or edition she's looking at. Maybe she means there's no numbers, but there's definitely oisius that number the pages. It's Daf Yud Daled, which is the last page, the last leaf. Daf Yud Daled in the second column, after the Seif, which today is commonly known as Seif Lamed Vav Tzava, where it says Lo Yaniach Adam Eluskei Kem Ishtoi Laila Shatov Laboy. So on the one hand, if it's Leil Tvila, a man should be with his wife. The pretty famous fact that is observed, that it's almost like a chiyuv, or there's something wrong, there's a risk in not being together the night of the Tvila. So if you look in that edition, it continues writing straight. Like I said, everything's written straight, but this is written straight after that. Isha Shetavla B'Leil Nittel. But if she told Nittel, then she should not allow her husband to lie with her. So that is what she was referring to. So when I finally found it, it was very amazing to actually see this text appear in this version of the Tzava, and it's written mamish behemshich echad, smack in the middle of the Tzava. It certainly would give you the impression that it's part of the Tzava. I'll point out, before I continue, the interesting shinui in the lashon. That in the Tzava as printed, the lashon is loy taniach, like she shouldn't let. Interesting wording, interesting language. Whereas all this form afterwards all say loy tizdakek, which is more neutral. And as I already alluded to earlier, they're all the Gur Aryeh and the Chuppos Chasanim are all written in the identical lashon, as well as the technically as well as the Zeicher David and the Miskaras HaShulchan. So it all certainly looks like after the Gerarie, everyone was just copying directly from him or copying from those who copied from him, and only the Gerarie himself was looking directly at some kind of printed version of Tzavas Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. Now, the context, just to allude to what her article is about, the premise of her article actually happens to be that she argues that all the minhagim relating to Nittel, so for example, Zivug, not to be misdavik, but Nittel, she claims lahavdil that many of the non-Jews in the area also had similar practices. They also had certain similar beliefs that children born from the union on this night will turn out to be no good. And so she has interesting theories about the origin, the genesis, what's going on over here. That's why the title of the article is about cultural transmission or cultural exchange. That even the particular very Jewish-seeming Menhagim Nittel, according to her, also have a parallel in the people in the area. We're not getting into that, but certainly food for thought, certainly interesting. So she moved you could say she moved the research a bit further by being mitzayin to the tzava. There's an actual tzava printed in 1718 that has this text, but it doesn't really solve or answer or address the question fully, because how did it end up? How did this line end up in this tzava? And like the other Ephraim already said, essentially the question is it not from the tzava and it got added to the tzava, or is it the opposite? It's from the tzava, but it was censored, and that's why you don't find it. Now, if you look, as the Yad Ephraim said, you look through all the standard prints, even earlier. So, for example, I think the first print of Tzavas Yehudah Chassid was in the year Shin Yud Beis. That's the 1550s, pretty early on. So they printed a sefer called Shimush Tehillim, which is its own very fascinating work of what each mizmor in Tehillim is mesugul for as a segula. So at the end of Shimush Tehillim, they also included Tzavas Yehudah Chassid. I guess there was a sense that the two had something in common, that they're from the same shnit. And there, the tzava is a different seder. You start digging into these things, you find that the way you see it today, the way you know it today, wasn't necessarily always that way. So the seder, there's a different seder. So the appropriate seif about the Leil Tevila there is seif Lamed Aleph, but there's no Heisafa there about Nittel. Also, Kisvei Yad, I checked one Ksav Yad from also Mamish, like Shin Yud Gimel, Mamish at the same time. It's also Shimush Tehillim first, and then Tzava, and it's missing there as well. So if your theory was that they were mashmid but tfus, no, there's a Ksav Yad where it's missing as well. Unless you want to say that this Ksav Yad in particular was copied from the tfus, I don't know. I also checked another Ksav Yad from earlier, from Reish Chav Zayin, 1467, and there it's yet another seder, and there the Leil Tevila Sif Mem Beis, and I didn't see the Nittel thing there either. So I did my own, as they say, do your own research. I did a little bit of my own research, and you can certainly find very early editions where Kisvei Yad, where you do not find anything about Nittel. So it's not like it's been there all along, and then at some point it just got removed and censored, right? You have passages in the Gemara that were there all along, and then they got removed. That's not quite what's going on here. Then I saw that actually this Sefer Yesod Tshuva, which also is known by the title Yoreh Chatoim, sometimes it's printed under the name Yesod Tshuva, sometimes it was printed under the name Yoreh Chatoim. So it was reprinted anew recently. Like I said, it used to be very popular, and now it's out of style, but still has its fans. Someone reprinted it in Tafshin Samach under the name Yoreh Chatoim. And also Mochain Zichron Aaron, when they reprinted the Rekeach, they did their edition of the Rekeach, they also included it in the Chelik Beis of the Rekeach, because it's often attributed to the Rekeach, even though it's not quite. It's based on the teachings about Shuvah of the Rekeach, and passages in it might be derived from the Rekeach, but those who attribute it to the Rekeach are incorrect. It's not. The Rekeach did not create this handbook as in this form, but they included it there as well. And both of these new editions also include the Tzava part, including this line about Nittel. And in the Ha'ara they write, "B'tfusim hamucharim nishmat piska zu ayidei tzenzor, b'rabim chipsu hamakar lezeh hamuva b'sefer chupas chasanim daf kuf tes b'shem Rabbi Yehuda Chassid." So they're a bit aware. They're saying, this is here, and then it was censored, and then people were trying to figure out what the chupas chasanim was talking about. So they're alluding to this, although they don't mention the Gerarie. But I was wondering which tefus they're referring to, because she only was mitzayin to 1718. But this work, Yesod Tshuva Yerech HaTorah, has been printed since the Shin Mems. So the question is, that's the 1580s. So the question is, which tefus are they saying had it, and in which tefusim was it omitted and censored? By the way, when it comes to the Yesod Tshuva and the Yerech HaTorah, I know we just met it a few minutes ago. We don't know much about it, but there's actually a raid about this work, and some say that the person who printed it the second or third or fourth time sort of stole and ripped it off from the one who printed it previously. There's a whole parsha. I think there are those who reprinted the Yerech HaTorah tried to claim that it's not quite like that. You're attributing negative motives. It's not. It wasn't the intention. But there's some fun discussion about that as well. Not getting into that here. So there's something, it's tantalizing. Are there other defusim of Yesod Tshuva Tzavos Yibda Chassid as well that have this line? Now, while I was going through all this material, what was bothering me throughout was that there's a fellow, I don't remember his name at the moment, but he is associated with Eitzer HaPoskim, and his thing is that he's Isaac in Sefer Chasidim, Tzavos Yibda Chassid. So he reprinted the Sefer Chasidim a bunch of years ago in 2 volumes with Haaretz, with Kisvei Yad, and I bought it at the time. And then he printed another volume of Sefer Chasidim Miksav Yad, because we know that this is the Tfus Bologna. There was another, or Kissav Yad Bologna, another version of the Sefer Chasidim that has many more passages. So he has another chibur that contains that. Recently, I pointed, not my chiddush, but I pointed out that the story of the shepherd who couldn't daven, Rachmana Libaboy, actually already appears in the Sefer Chasidim in the Ksav Yad. So it goes way back, way before the Baal Shem Tov, all the way back to that wave of Chasidim, which is interesting. So a 4th volume, though, in the Sefer Chasidim, 2 volumes, he has the tzavah in the beginning, just a few pages, because that's traditionally, it's at the beginning of Sefer Chasidim, so he has it there, not really too many haaretz, just a couple of pages. But then, a couple of years later, he printed an entire sefer on the tzavah. Somehow he managed to turn it into, 400 pages, let's say. So when I saw it at the time, I thought, I need a whole sefer on the tzavah. I didn't buy it. I don't know if it's in print anymore. But all of a sudden it was bothering me. I was wondering, this edition, I would imagine, if they went thoroughly through all the prints and all the Kisvei Yad, I would imagine that they would address this additional line about Nittel. So I asked, they lucked out. I asked someone who I thought might have the sefer, and Poked had the sefer and graciously shared the pages with me. And so if you look it up there, he follows the numbering where this is Ois Lamed Vav. And so on Ois Lamed Vav, page Reish Tzadik Gimel, they just have the Leil Tevil, the regular text. They don't mention anything about Nittel. But then there's dozens of pages. The way the sefer is printed, the way it's formatted is you have the quote of each Ois of the Tzavah, or there they call it Tzavah Lamed Vav. And then there'll be whatever it is, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, but whatever it is, whatever there is to say, whatever is potentially connected, follows in the pages that follow. So if you continue leafing, you get to page Shin Beis, Shin Gimel, Shin Daled, there is a discussion there about what if Leil Tevila is Nittel. And there, in the Pnim and in Ara 21, it mentions that in Yerech HaTorah Tefus edition, it mentions about Nittel. So once I saw that gave me the inspiration to keep looking, to keep searching, to try to find an early search, because you look on the National Library of Israel, their Tfus edition Mamesh seems to be a copy that's missing the pages at the beginning, the pages at the end, so I couldn't see the tzavah there. There was another edition from the Shin Mems from Saloniki that didn't seem to have the line, but then I found that on the National Library of Israel they have another copy from the Shin Mems. It seems like, if the dates there are correct, it was printed multiple times in the Shin Mems, so it was an extremely popular, big hit when it came out. So there's a copy there which they date to Shin Mem Zion, so about 1587. And in that copy, which is missing other pages, I found on the last page of that section, it also has some other stuff, Eldad Hadani, random stuff that were added to it. But the last page of that section, you have the Tzavah, and indeed, already in Shin Mem Zion, you have that Lashon in the Tzavah, after it says, Lo Yaniach Adam, whatever the formulation is, Isha Shetava Below Nittel, Letaniach Baila Lishkav Ima. So it actually does appear in the Tzavah, printed in that version of it was called the Yesod Tshuva, printed in the Yesod Tshuva in 1587. So that means it's correct that this nusach always appeared in this version of the tzava printed in the Sefer. Now, this still doesn't fully resolve what actually happened here. I'm still leaning towards saying that this was a later edition, presumably added around then. But the real experts would have to really crawl through all the Kesvei Yad and Bechlal, research what's going on. Are there any other Shinuim, any other Hisafis in the Nusach of the Tzava in this work? And I saw that Simcha Emanuel, who's of course a big expert on the Torah of the Rishonim, so he has an article on the Chiburim of the Rekeach, which this is related to, from Tafshin Samach Aleph. So in footnote 84, he mentions that you have the first prints of the Tzava and the Shimush Tehillim and in the Yesod Shuvah. And he says that the Yesod Shuvah has not been adequately researched, the text and its influence on the text. It makes it sound like almost like the text of the Tzava going forward tracks pretty close. I mean, the standard, like I said, in the Kesvei Yad, there's a lot of variation. And he makes it sound like the standard text of the Tzava, the version that's become standard, seems to follow the way it was printed in Yesod Shuvah. So that means that Yesod Shuvah is actually a very central and important source for the text of the Tzava. So that would mean that it appeared there and then was censored afterwards. So those who speculated that it was censored would be correct. But the question still would be, what do we know about what led up to that point? Obviously, there's a lot of time elapsed between 1217, or whatever the date of the passing of Yehuda Chassid is, and 1587. So it's not 100% clear, but that's already beyond our capabilities at the moment. But there's still, I believe, this truly advances this topic by a lot, because l'chayra, this then becomes the earliest makar, b'ksav and b'tfus, about this minig of Nittel specifically, and about the minhagim of Nittel b'chlal. Because usually, as the earliest makar, the Metzayin and Makar Chaim, or Bir Bachrach, which was only printed in the last 50 years, and then all the other makars are much later. Here you have something printed in Krakow, I believe it was printed in Krakow, in 1587, where it says clearly, Schwarze Weiß, that's Shlei Taniach Bail Lishkavima Beleil Nittel. So that is actually quite important, quite notable, and every discussion and presentation of the history of Nittel should start from this source, which has certainly not been the case. I have not seen that any of those who have written about the Toldos of Nittel, Bechlal, whether it's the Svarim writing on it, or whether it's the researchers, including the researchers I mentioned, I have not seen that this has been used. The only ones who are aware of it are those who reprinted the Yoyre Chatoim and the fellow who printed the Tzavas Yehuda Chassid and Eitzer HaPeskim. And even they just mentioned it B'derech Agav because they're just being oisik in those other chiburim. They're not writing about Nittel comprehensively. So those who have written about Nittel comprehensively do not seem to be aware of this. So when we come to if we have to revisit the topic and present the topic, step one is in Tzavas or Yehuda Chassid, the second instance in print, perhaps the most influential edition, which shaped the way it's printed afterwards. In 1587, it says that on Leil Nittel, woman should not allow her husband to lie with her. That is ground zero. This is where it begins. And then the Gur Aryeh must have seen one of the versions of it which had this text, and it was not 1718 because he passed away before that. So he must have seen an earlier copy. He included it in his Gur Aryeh. And then the Chuppos Chasanim must have seen it in the Gur Aryeh. Chuppos Chasanim then was popular enough and circulated enough that that became pretty influential. Mechus Lazar says that's the makar, one of B'Metzayin to makar, B'Metzayin to the Chuppos Chasanim. So that is the evolution of the source from the Tzavos Yehuda Chassid. Can't say for sure when it actually entered the text. Like I said, I saw an earlier Ksav Yad from Reish Chav Zayin. I believe it does not have it. So I'm not saying it goes back to Yehuda Chassid, but also her theories about who copied from whom also need to be revisited, because 1587 is different than 1718, whatever date she gave. If it already says it in a text in 1587, then that probably means that it goes back at least a bit before, maybe not to Yehuda Chassid himself, but somewhat further back. So I think this scrambles the calculations, and we have to revisit and reconsider what we actually think we know about this topic. So I think that was a fitting topic, like I said, Nittel Acher Chatzais, when according to the Minchas Elazar, is Dafka the Isser Zivug, Nittel kicks in at Chatzais, what time is more appropriate, but also once limud Torah is permitted, what better time than that to explore all of these sources and to reveal what is technically known information, but has not been known by enough and has not been acknowledged and discussed by enough, and that's that.